In this episode of IT SPARC Cast, Lou takes a bite out of Apple, Intel flushes Pat Gelsinger's cache, and VMware alternatives are making kissy faces at you.
Ooh, cooties.
Welcome to IT SPARC Cast. I'm your host, John Barger.
And I'm your host, Lou Schmidt.
It's Friday, December 6th, day 2 of the 12 days of OpenAI. What will Santa Altman give us today?
Hopefully not hallucinating models. Oh, I'm sorry. Is everyone having fun?
IT SPARC Cast is a digest of the IT news over the last week with insights, opinions, and a little sarcasm from two experts with over 20 years of experience working in IT or for IT vendors. And now, the news bites.
I would love to do a news bite session with you, John, where we are not doing security updates. And I
Not
fear
gonna happen.
that's not going to happen. So, here we are. WordPress is going to lead us off today. WordPress, there was a major problem with an anti-spam plugin, a vulnerability, 200,000 sites of WordPress. Now, I wanted to talk about this one because WordPress tends to be one of those IT infrastructure set it and forget it type things. Folks put them up all over the place. They're not always IT run, but there's a big vulnerability. Here's what's going on. There's a severe vulnerability in the CleanTalk anti-spam WordPress plugin that enables unauthorized attackers to upload plugins and launch attacks. This one is a 9.8 on the Ocrapometer. All right. This is a major own, and this is how it works. Essentially, and this plugin is a really highly rated plugin. It up until now, it's been fantastic. But what happens is an attacker can do a reverse DNS cache poisoning, whether they poison your cache or they poison something upstream, and they can tell the system that it should install something. And when it goes and it looks up where it's coming from, it comes back with them. That's the oh yeah, you're the one doing this. And then it doesn't check. So this is a nasty one because there's a lot of attack vectors out there that have the capability to do poison reverse lookups on DNS. And at this point, it will completely own your WordPress. And John, you and I have seen sites that run entirely off of WordPress. We built sites that work entirely off of WordPress. WordPress is awesome.
It's got it is. And at our last gig, I ran the sales enablement division, and our LMS was built on WordPress. And I'm a big fan of WordPress. But I think that if I were running IT for that company, I probably would have wanted to have a bit more control over that system. And the reason is specific
open source, right?
Right. And the thing is that to allow a group outside of IT to run a system that has authentication through the corporate Active Directory and that has corporate information on it and people logging into it, while I did it, and it was partially because I didn't have the support that I needed. We had a great IT team, but in this area, I didn't have the support I needed. I ran it myself. And you, as IT managers and administrators and those that own the IT processes, need to be very aware of what's running on your network and put some controls in place.
And that means helping out. So, the good news is there's a patch out for this. Yes, this has been exploited. If you upgrade your plugin to version 6.44 or above, you'll be safe from this until the next one comes out, because that is the world in which we live. But speaking of things that are moving quite a bit, we're seeing a lot going on in virtualization. John, you want to bring us up to speed on that one?
You bet. So up till now, the process of migrating from VMware to something like Proxmox has been difficult, to say the least. But in the latest version of Proxmox, they released an integration tool to allow you to easily import VMware-based VMs. So we get this from No Lab, No Party, and from Ars Technica, where the latest Proxmox release introduces an integration tool designed to streamline the migration of VMs from vSphere to Proxmox. This tool simplifies the import process, reducing the need for complex procedures and making it more accessible for users to transition their workloads. To utilize this features, users can log into a Proxmox node via a supported browser and navigate to the repository section to add the no subscription repositories. Now, there's a lot more information about this. I suggest you read about it. But my thinking here is we are seeing more and more people getting upset with the pricing and other restrictions that are coming along with VMware and are looking for alternatives. And if that alternative is difficult to migrate to, you might not go that way. Now we're seeing vendors like Proxmox make it easy. I think that we're going to see more and more of this happen. I think we're going to see more vendors and more in the open source community, more teams start providing these migration tools to make it really easy to avoid the Broadcom tax that you're now having to pay on your VMware systems.
You know, here's the thing that I found, adding to this, another article from Ars Technica, Beeks Group, which is a company in the UK that provides virtualization services for financial institutions. So folks, if you haven't worked directly with a bank or a stock exchange or whatever, you may not be as familiar with this, but these are extremely conservative organizations, right? They do not want to change things. It is risky. They are making money. They would much rather spend more money and reduce risk than anything. So this particular company, Beeks, saw 1,000% increase in its licensing, 1,000%. So what they did is they went to OpenNebula and worked with OpenNebula, and it had a really interesting side effect. So I don't have the details on how they did the import. They're still running a couple of VMware virtual machines for companies that insist on it, but they've largely migrated to OpenNebula. So both in the case of Proxmox and OpenNebula, they're both based on the same virtualization technology, which is KVM, kernel virtualization mode. And this KVM started right about, I have a long history in playing with this stuff. KVM started right about the time that VMware did. So there was a lot of back and forth work on it, but KVM was concentrated on Linux. You actually can compile it directly into the kernel, directly into the operating systems. It's very, very powerful as far as efficiency. And that is an interesting point, because what Beeks found out when they started doing this is that not only Proxmox can handle, if I remember correctly, they can also handle containers. I know that OpenNebula is pretty much saying LXC. LXC and LXD technology came out of the open source world, mostly pushed by Canonical. Really good project. I've used it extensively for virtualization on all things Chrome OS. I was able to show enterprise or service provider class automation provisioning on a Chromebook running on LXC, which was pretty impressive. Pretty impressive.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting to me about this is you mentioned how conservative banks are. You're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. Just the name alone, you would think, would be a barrier for a lot of banks. Of OpenNebula. You know, you take those, that's one word in this case, but you split that into two root words, and neither one of the things that the banks are going to be, you know, real thrilled about. So that means that there was a massive incentive here, and that they really sold this and convinced the bank that this was the right thing to do.
Well, I mean, there's another point here. You're right. And what was one of those compelling things? Well, everybody's driven by cost. All business is driven by risk and reward, right? How much money can I increase? How can I decrease my risk? And the interesting thing with this is that Beeks was able to take 3,000 bare metal servers that were dedicated to VM management under VMware and put them into production as actual host-facing machines for virtual hosting. 3,000. They also saw a 200% increase in VM efficiency. So they're able to push more load through. So this stuff's been out there for a while. we as sort of a field tend to get locked into these modes, just like everybody else does, right? As things become mature, we're like, well, let's go and use this. We've always used this. It always works. And eventually something will come along that shakes things up and we'll have to reevaluate. Now is an incredibly good time to be doing that evaluation. If you are not playing around with some KVM based virtualization system, whether it's Proxmox, OpenNebula, OpenStack, if you really want to go nuts over controlling what this thing could do, OpenStack has that power, but it's complicated. You go anywhere from easy to complicated, same baseline technology. You really need to be looking at this. You've gotta. The pricing,
yeah, and I'm just thinking,
get better.
I'm thinking about the cost, 1,000% increase in the licenses. You could say, and as you said, we don't know what the effort was to do this port over to OpenNebula, but at that 1,000% increase, you take a fraction of that, then you can probably pay for the human putty required to make that transition happen.
It's not. I've done that. I've done the transition. I've moved. I have a Windows virtual machine. When I need to run Windows, I run it in a virtual machine.
Right.
And I don't have any dedicated hardware for it because it's not a thing I use normally. I use Linux and I use Mac OS and Android and other things. But every once in a while, all of us should have the ability to put up any environment we need to have because it's not about the operating system. The operating system isn't a good hill to die on. Applications are a good hill to die on. And if there's an application that must run on a certain operating system, you're going there. But I have actually moved a virtual machine from ESXi that I was running on a Linux box into KVM. It's not that hard to do. And once you figure out what the settings look like, there's no reason. KVM allows massive amounts of scripting when you're actually importing a virtual machine. So there's a huge amount of choices there. So your human spackle cost, as he said, it's sort of a 1 or 2 time. And then after that, it's all making sure the transitions went across well and that everything came up the way you wanted it to. It's not as onerous a task as you would think.
The other interesting point is that 200% increase in VM efficiency. And I'm going to just step back a second because I actually got my VCP, my VMware Certified Professional, back in the VMware ESXi 3.5 days, so 2008 probably. And I was a big fan. And up to recently, I was still using VMware in my home lab and things like that. But the reason I always used it and continue to use it, and I looked at things like KVM and other stuff, is it was just easy. I already knew the system and everything was it was laid out well, easy to use. But I'm wondering if what happened, and this is supposition, so I'm kind of taking a leap here, is if over time, normal bloat happened to VMware that you've seen in almost every operating system that has been around for a long period of time. If you look at Windows, even though I'm a fan, Mac OS has got a lot of bloat in it these days. You're seeing that in the mobile operating system starting to happen. And what's happened is the younger, leaner, more necessarily efficient due to its open source nature of something like a KVM or one of the other tools has actually led to that performance increase. And now you're talking about savings on the hardware costs as well. If you're moving to still locally hosted, you may be cutting down from 200 servers to 100 servers or some number similar to that. And then again, that's not just the cost of the machines, it's the cost of power, it's the cost of cooling, it's the rack space, it's all these other things that you have to take into account that you may be making a massive savings by moving off of
and KVM has always been a little more efficient because you can compile it at the kernel level. There's kernel level hooks for KVM. And if you've ever compiled your own Linux kernel, we're going to go back to Linux here because most of these large scale hostings are running on Linux. You have an enormous amount of control over how tightly you want this integrated. You can strip out all the bloat. But I think to your point about bloat in VMware, especially when you're looking at vCenter and all the vmove and the storage options, is very valid. Another thing has happened in the open source world, and that is folks are making it easier. I use Virtual Manager on Linux. I've got UTM on the Mac. Why did I get into KVM? Well, everybody who's running virtual machines on networking devices is basically using KVM. I played with it before that, but then I inadvertently became the expert in our last job on running virtual machines inside of switch routers. Our particular company had a really good implementation, but they weren't doing a very good job of getting it out there. And once I figured out what you could do with this thing, then I really started digging into it. Because of OpenNebula, because of Proxmox, they've always been around. Good time to go dig into it. Speaking of things we need to dig into, though, we're talking about hardware optimization. This one is a little less optimized than most people think about.
Absolutely. So, as per every news source on the planet, Pat Gelsinger stepped down as Intel CEO on December 1st, 2024. Now, it's an interesting date in that that's a Sunday. And he did this after less than 4 years in the role. So the reports indicate that the board lost confidence in his turnaround strategy, leading to his departure. So we specifically looked at Reuters, Barron, Financial Times, and Tom's Hardware to get the details, and we'll include links to all of those articles in the show notes. We just wanted to cover as many different angles as possible to come look at this, because this is a really big seismic level shift. In the interim, until they find a new CEO, Chief Financial Officer David Zinsner and Executive Vice President Michelle Johnson Holthaus will be serving as co-CEOs. We're going to talk about that and what that might mean coming up. Ouch. The board is actively searching for a permanent replacement, focusing on candidates with substantial experience in the semiconductor manufacturing and product development space. The potential candidates include former board member Lip-Bu Tan and executives from companies such as Apple, TSMC, Marvell, and Broadcom. This is interesting, and I think that what we're well, Lou, give me your take on it, and I'll tell you mine, because I got some thoughts here.
I mean, you want to talk about the granddaddy of the computing revolution? When you really get down to it, and who would have thought that we would come to this place, and how did we get here? We've been talking about this. I think one thing that's going to come out, and it'll be interesting to see if I'm right about this, but I grew up in the Silicon Valley. I worked in the Silicon Valley for many years. I had friends at Intel and Apple, and you hear all the scuttlebutt internally. You still hook up with these people, and you talk about what's going on. One crucial thing that you have to know about Intel is that when TSMC came into existence, Taiwan Semiconductors, it was a whole new business model. TSMC is a company that makes chips that doesn't design chips. All they do is fab. Now, everybody up to that point was doing ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits. In fact, my wife worked for a company called NEC. And what they would do is, if they had holes in their process line, they were making DRAM, they were making embedded microprocessors, stuff like that, they would slide in other companies' designs. So you get some tape out, you get some wafer time, you get a short run on their process. TSMC came along and sort of upended that entire business. What most people don't realize is there's an enormous cost to move between processes. And every time you do what's called a node shift. A node is a process at a certain lithography level, right? So say I'm making chips at 65 nanometers, and then I'm going to go to 50, and then I'm going to go to 45. Every time I do that, I need new engravers, new steppers, better masking, different chemical processes to etch the chips. It's like a whole new way to build a building. So the way Intel has traditionally been doing it, many companies, they used to use something called a tick-tock methodology. They would do a tick, which was a change to the process. They'd move to a node, and they would take their previous design, their previous architecture, think of it as the design of the building, and they would just implement it on a smaller node. Well, you're immediately going to get benefits from that, right? Smaller die size means more concentrated transistors, which means lower switching losses because you're running lower voltages, all that good stuff. The talk, they would basically redesign the building. They would say, okay, new architecture. we've got some new things we can take advantage of. We've got some signal things we patched over here that didn't patch well enough. Elevator isn't going all the way to the top, whatever it has to be. Recently, in 2016, they moved to a new process where they were going from tick, new node, talk, changing the architecture, to what they were at that point calling a secondary talk, which was optimization on that architecture. Optimization is a tough one because you have to watch the physics of what the chip is actually doing. And we're getting to the point in these processes, we're running out of atoms, literally running out of atoms in the thickness of these gates. It is astounding to me. So to put this, why am I digressing into this? Intel normally would move through a node in about 24 to 36 months, right? There would be the node change, there would be the re-architecting, and then there would be the optimization. And there was roughly 12 months between those. And you would see these in your releases of your data center and commercial chips. My understanding is Intel has gone through 5 nodes in 4 years in this turnaround plan. 5 nodes, 4 years.
Well, I mean, that stems from how far behind they were, right? Because
absolutely,
the reality is that they were getting their clock cleaned on die size and the node size that they were running at for years and years and years. And it's interesting is you use the discussion about they were kind of king of technology, king of hardware back in the day. And there's 2 ways a king goes out. A king either there's a revolution and he gets taken out very quickly, or very slow decline into decrepitness and death. And I think that that's what we've been seeing. And I'm not calling the death of Intel, but there has been a really slow, clumsy decline in what Intel's been doing, and seeing the upstart with TSMC and others that are just making it laughable almost. And the fact that you can have, let's take in the x86 and x64 space, AMD is also making leaps and bounds and really embarrassing Intel in a lot of ways. A lot of these new handheld game systems running AMD processors with integrated graphics are great. I've got one. Just Intel doesn't seem to be able to get out of its own way, and that's why they brought Gelsinger in. But here's my thinking on this: is I think that the board was super concerned, as they should be, about the path they were on and getting off of that path. But they wanted to take this, to use an analogy that we used in a previous episode, this cargo ship, and get it to turn on a dime. And you can't turn it on a dime. And I think that what was happening is that, as Gelsinger may or may not have been making the right decisions. I'm not going to judge that. That's not my job to judge him. But I don't feel that 4 years to completely revolutionize that company is enough time. And I think
I would have to agree with you.
Yeah, it's just, so then the question is what's going to happen next? Are they going to push a CEO to make rapid, dramatic changes in this? And are they going to see that have a negative impact? In the cargo ship analogy, are we going to see it capsize? Are we going to see it get worse? Or, the only kind of caveat I would put in here is that if you take some maybe history lessons from somebody like an Elon Musk, who, whether you love him or hate him, one of the things he can do is pivot. And that maybe that if they can come up with a strategy that's more Musk-like than you would expect, then maybe they can get a quick pivot out of this. We know they want to sell off their foundry business. They want to focus on the products. Maybe they can find somebody to do that. It'll be interesting to watch. I got popcorn.
Essence, I've got popcorn too, but it's sad, salty popcorn, not happy caramel popcorn, because this is a major industrial area for the United States. I don't want to see Intel go down. On the other hand, if you've been watching microarchitectures lately, this isn't a shock. AMD spun off its fabs when it ran into its first major roadblock with Intel in the data center space to a company called GlobalFoundries. They spun it out as their own company, and GlobalFoundries is, as far as I know, still out there or got absorbed by somebody, but it's out there. So they took care of that. Meanwhile, there's this upstart bunch of Brits that created something called the ARM. Acorn Computing created ARM. Acorn Computing's gone, but it turns out ARM is really good for power optimization. And x86 architectures have challenges with that. It's just the way, it's the nature of the system. So I want to see them succeed. I too am incredibly concerned yet curious to see how the board wants to go about doing this, because they're going to have to do some new things. Intel is not hugely noted for new things.
They're not. We're definitely going to continue to follow this, and we'll report out to you as more happens.
And now for something completely different.
So now it's time for the CVE of the week.
Ah! And here we go again. You would think that most of the rest of this thing was the CVE of the week. And we haven't even talked about the breach of lawful intercept systems that everybody's been talking about for the past couple of days. Why are we not talking about that? Well, everybody else is talking about it. And I don't want to go down a rat hole right now. I know how it happened and where it happened. But let's talk about something a little closer to home if you're in the enterprise. And that is Apple. Apple has released a couple of breaches. So there's an Apple multiple product code execution vulnerability in Apple iOS, Mac OS, and other Apple products. So this is a services issue, services level issue. It contains an unspecified vulnerability when processing maliciously crafted web content. Now, who would ever maliciously do something on the web? I mean, I'm shocked. You see my shocked face? I'm green with shock. That's how shocked I am. So this one has been seen in the wild on Intel-based Macs. I think we talked about it on our last weekly. Once again, it's CVE 2024-44308, and it's been patched. So get out there and patch it, because at the same time, Apple multiple products cross-site scripting vulnerability. So why do we keep seeing this stuff? Because you're going to put, and this isn't just an Apple problem. I wanted to highlight Apple to realize, yes, Apple has problems too. Linux has problems. Windows, we beat the crap out of Windows, right? And we should. It's widely deployed in the business world. But Apple has challenges too. And we definitely see this. The thing that bothers me about this Apple multiple products cross-site scripting is it's iOS, it's Mac OS, other products like the Visual OS and all this, processing maliciously crafted web content can lead to a cross-site scripting attack. Usually this is because your core engine, your core web rendering engine has a problem, right? And we see the same thing on other operating systems. If you have an embedded application on Windows or Android or Linux or something that's going to take advantage of an existing resource, and in this case, it's WebKit Safari on the Mac, a vulnerability in that shared system will trip up everything that touches it. And because we like to share these resources between different systems, we end up getting into serious trouble. So,
well, that's the interesting thing about this one, in that one of the benefits of Apple is the tight integration between all of the Apple-owned components, and the fact that the password manager and the browser, and the integration with your address book, the contacts, and the integration with Siri, and the integration with all these different pieces are so tightly coupled together that if one of those pieces gets really pwned, then that could actually be really, really, really bad. So it's really kind of an interesting state. I actually saw Tom Merritt from the Daily Tech News Show posted on X that he's now thinking that maybe Apple should move away from WebKit and move to Chromium, and kind of the war is about the browser, not about the browser engine. I'm not sure I buy that. I think that competition is good, and competition on the back end is still competition. But it was an interesting discussion that Tom brought up, and
Especially since
well,
Chromium's a fork of WebKit. I don't know if you knew that.
I actually didn't know that.
It's a fork of
That's
WebKit. Yes.
wow.
So,
And
yeah, this stuff is all so tightly intertwined, where it came from.
yeah,
So it's like, and obviously there've been over the years there've been, the V8 rendering engine and all this stuff, all these changes that have happened inside these engines, and of course Apple has evolved their own in other ways, and now you get new browsers built to process technology. We are moving into an area of the web where having common infrastructure makes a lot of sense. I would say my point on this one is this happened to Apple. Please patch. We
yes,
patch religiously, but some folks don't. The secondary thing is this also plays in the background of something else we haven't really gotten into yet, John, talking about the DOJ wanting to break up Google and break
mm,
off Chrome and all that stuff. And it's my observation personally that when we see this stuff is right about when the stuff they want to break up is becoming increasingly less relevant.
exactly right.
Same way, right?
Well, that's why I haven't really put that into any of our articles about that breakup, because first of all, I don't see it happening. If you look at every big threat, since AT&T got broken up, since Ma Bell got broken up, very rarely does that happen. Microsoft's been under threat multiple times. There are others, and Microsoft's just gotten bigger. I mean, they just made one of the biggest acquisitions in the planet's history recently. So it's and as you said, those things at Google that are the threat are going to become less relevant, especially as we're seeing the growth of AI. AI is going to eat search's lunch.
Exactly.
I'm starting to use it much more often as a search to give me context versus just searching for a website to go read. I think lots of people are going to move that direction. I've got OpenAI voice mode set as the action button on my phone, so I hit the button and I talk to it instead of going up and pulling up Google and doing a search. So I think you're absolutely right that that's going to become much ado about nothing, which is why we haven't really talked.
I think so, but it does point to how much that we're seeing a lot of stuff on the surface that looks different as our area matures, and then the next big thing pops up, right? The AI is obviously the big thing now. um, what will that common underback look like? It's what kind of security? We already have the issues of AIs hallucinating. We don't call it a security breach. Your AI is just freaking nuts when you ask it a certain question. and
Yeah.
and how do you tell when that's happening? So as we start to converge the technology, best practices become spread. That is, in my opinion, the genius of having the Silicon Valley as such. People move around between companies, best practices spread.
Well, Lou, let's take a note on that and maybe do a deep dive or a series on the future of AI and the back ends, because we have seen consolidation to some degree on the browser, back end engines. We know that things like Edge and others are using Chromium, and
Yeah,
now you educated me on that Chromium is actually based on WebKit. But with technology, things kind of diverge, and you see a lot of things maybe going to more standards and using standard backends, or you start seeing things become super proprietary. From our experience of network management for switching is very open with SNMP and things like that. But the network management for wireless is very, very proprietary.
very.
And we might, I think we could see a war happening there, on the even though the company's name is OpenAI. I don't think they're going to be opening up a lot, and I think they're going to continue to be more proprietary. So I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. But let's table that, and maybe we'll do a deep dive on
We've
that.
taken enough of your time. Oh, just an aside, 2013, Google forked for the Blink engine. So Chromium originally, Google Chrome started on WebKit and then they forked WebKit.
Got it.
So how much of that original code remains, optimizations, how much stuff going back and forth between them? The new backend is called Blink, which is what Edge is using as well. But it all sort of started with WebKit. So that's interesting.
It is. It is. So that's going to cover this week's episode. We couldn't do this podcast without listeners like you. We really want to hear what you think. Do you have a topic you want us to cover? Do you want us to dive deep into what the back ends of AI might look like in the future? Do you have thoughts on what we talked about today? Do you think that something different about Pat Gelsinger's exit? Is there more to it that we missed? Any other points you want us to cover? Send email to feedback@itsparkcast.com. That's feedback@itsparkcast.com or @itsparkcast on X. Be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. That's really going to help us grow. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues about us. If you feel like you're getting a lot of value out of us, make sure that they're getting that same value. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.